Be me Aaron, 26 years old, fresh out of law school and drowning in student debt. I landed a junior associate position at a decent firm in the city, the kind of place with dark wood paneling, expensive art on the walls, and senior partners who looked like they were born wearing a three-piece suit. My life wasn't just about the law, though. I had a pretty big online presence. Not an influencer, nothing like that, but I ran a blog and a social media account dedicated to feminist commentary. I was sharp, I was witty, and I was, in my own mind, a warrior for justice. My posts were mostly critiques of media, politics, and what I called the everyday architecture of patriarchy. They got a lot of traction, thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. It felt good. It felt like I was making a difference, even from behind a keyboard. A few months ago, maybe in late spring, a story was making the rounds online. Some tech CEO got accused of misconduct by an ex-girlfriend. The details were murky, but the internet had already convicted him. He released a statement claiming he was the victim of a smear campaign. I saw it as a classic example of a powerful man playing the victim. I screen-capped his statement and wrote a caption that, at the time, I thought was incredibly clever. Something along the lines of how the feigned tears of privileged men were the world's tiniest violin, playing a song only they could hear. I wrote about how the system was built by them and for them, and their shock when it occasionally malfunctioned was just proof of their entitlement. The post blew up. It was my biggest one yet. The validation was a rush. I felt like I was on the front lines of a cultural battle, and I was winning. The next morning, I walked into the firm feeling 10 feet tall. That feeling lasted until about 10:15 a.m., when Manuel's assistant told me he wanted to see me. Manuel was the M in Manuel, Davies and Finch, a legal dinosaur with a reputation for being brilliant and utterly ruthless. He rarely spoke to junior associates. I walked into his massive corner office. He was staring out the window, a cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't turn around. He just told me to sit. After a long silence, he finally turned and looked at me. He had this look on his face, a kind of weary amusement. He said he'd seen my extracurricular activities online. My heart sank. I thought I was about to be fired for my social media presence, but he just smiled, a thin, humorless smile. He told me that idealism was a wonderful thing in the young. Then he slid a thin, sad-looking manila folder across his polished desk. It stopped right in front of me. He informed me that this was my first significant case, a pro bono assignment. He said the firm liked to give its junior associates opportunities to cut their teeth on cases that mattered. I opened the folder. The name on top was Scott. The charge was sexual assault. My eyes scanned the first page. The accuser was a woman named Crystal. The police report stated there was no physical evidence, no witnesses, but the DA was pursuing the case due to significant social media attention and public pressure. My blood ran cold. I looked up at Manuel, confused. I told him I couldn't possibly take this case. I explained that my deeply held personal beliefs made it a clear conflict of interest. I tried to sound professional, like a real lawyer. Manuel leaned back in his leather chair. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He then explained to me, very slowly, as if I were a child, that my personal beliefs were for my blog. In his firm, I was an officer of the court, and every person deserved a defense. He said the man in that folder, Scott, was facing years in prison based on an accusation. My job was not to believe him. My job was to defend him. He added that he specifically chose me for this case. He called it a practical education in the nuances of the justice system. He wasn't asking. He was telling me. I was the new counsel for the defense. I left his office feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, staring at the file. Scott, Crystal, The words swam before my eyes. That night, I met up with my friends. They were my echo chamber, the same people who cheered on my online posts. When I told them about the case, their reaction was immediate and unified. They were horrified. They said the firm was punishing me for my feminism. They told me Scott was obviously a monster and that I should just go through the motions. They said my real duty was to Crystal, to all women, not to some man who was finally getting what he deserved. One of them even suggested I should subtly sabotage the case. I went home that night feeling even worse. Their words had validated my own disgust, my own certainty. I decided they were right. I would be professional, but I would not invest myself. I would do the bare minimum the law required of me. I would give this man a defense, as ordered, but I wouldn't have to like it. I wouldn't have to believe him. The first time I met Scott was a few days later in a small windowless meeting room at the firm. I had built him up in my mind into a villain, a master manipulator, a covert predator hiding behind a mask of normalcy. The man who walked in was nothing. He was just a guy, maybe 30, thinning hair, glasses. He wore a rumpled button-down shirt that looked a size too big. He didn't look at me. He just sat down and stared at his hands on the table. He was the physical embodiment of the word nondescript. I was all business, cold, detached. I introduced myself and explained my role. I asked him to tell me what happened. He spoke so quietly, I had to lean forward to hear him. He didn't make excuses. He didn't get angry. He just laid out his version of events in a flat, emotionless monotone. He said he met Crystal on a dating app. They went for drinks. Said the conversation was fine, a little awkward, but fine. He walked her to her apartment building. Said he didn't go inside. He said he went home. The whole time he spoke, he seemed defeated. Not like a man fighting for his freedom, but like someone who had already accepted his fate. It was unsettling. I was prepared for bluster, for anger, for lies. I was not prepared for this quiet, pathetic emptiness. The meeting was short. I asked my questions, took my notes, and told him I'd be in touch. He just nodded. I walked out of that room feeling deeply frustrated. His demeanor hadn't convinced me of his innocence, but it had thoroughly confused me. He didn't fit the profile. My internal narrative, the one where he was a cunning monster, was starting to fray at the edges. It was annoying. I wanted this to be simple. For the next week or so, I did my due diligence. I read the police report again and again. It was incredibly thin. Crystal's statement was pure emotion. She claimed he had assaulted her at her doorway, but there were no details, no specific actions described. It just said he forced himself on her. No witnesses, no DNA, no injuries documented in the medical report she filed the next day. The case seemed to be built entirely on her word and the social media outrage she had successfully generated. Legally, it was a weak case for the prosecution, but in the court of public opinion, Scott was already in a cell. Crystal's posts about her trauma and bravery were going viral. My client was being portrayed as a predator online. I knew I needed more from Scott. I couldn't build a defense on "I didn't do it." So I scheduled another meeting. I was determined to get the details I needed, regardless of my personal feelings. He showed up in the same rumpled shirt. We sat in the same sterile room. This time, I was more direct. I told him I needed a timeline, a minute-by-minute account of the entire night, from the moment he met her to the moment he got home. I told him not to leave anything out, no matter how insignificant. He seemed to respond to the directness. Maybe it was the kind of logical problem he could solve. He was an IT specialist, after all. He started talking. He gave me the name of the bar. He told me they arrived around 8 p.m. He remembered what they drank because he paid, and he still had the receipt in his banking app. He showed it to me on his phone. 2 gin and tonics, 1 craft beer. timestamped 8:23 p.m. He recounted their conversation. He said they talked about work, about movies, about travel. It sounded like a completely normal, unremarkable first date. He said they left around 10:30 p.m. He remembered because he checked the time, worried about his last train. He then said he decided to get a rideshare instead. He pulled out his phone again and showed me the trip history. A ride, picked up from the street corner by the bar, dropped off at his home address. The trip started at 10:47 p.m. and ended at 11:12 p.m. Verifiable, concrete. Then he got to the crucial part, the walk to her apartment. He said her building was only a few blocks from the bar. He told me he walked her to the main entrance. He said she asked him if he wanted to come up. And here, for the first time, his story had a new detail. He told me he politely declined. He said he was tired, had an early meeting the next day, and just wasn't feeling a strong connection. A simple, awkward, end-of-date rejection. According to Scott, her demeanor changed instantly. He said she got cold, accused him of leading her on, and called him boring. He said he was taken aback, apologized if she felt that way, and then he left. That was it. That was the interaction. He walked to the corner, ordered his ride, and went home. I sat there, just staring at him. His story wasn't a vague denial. It was a sequence of events supported by digital receipts and a plausible, if unflattering, social dynamic. An awkward date ending with a bruised ego. I pulled out Crystal's official statement again. I laid it on the table next to my notes from Scott's timeline. Her statement, we went for drinks. He walked me home and assaulted me at my door around 11 p.m. Scott's timeline. Left the bar at 10:47 p.m. in a car miles away from her apartment by 11 p.m. Her statement was a single, explosive sentence. His was a boring, verifiable story, full of mundane details that had the unmistakable ring of truth. It was the first time I felt it, a cold, prickling sensation in my gut. It wasn't belief in his innocence, not yet. It was doubt, a profound, professional doubt in the official story. For the first time, I wasn't looking at a feminist issue. I was looking at two conflicting stories, and one of them was full of holes. I walked out of that second meeting with Scott feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. The neat, clean lines of my worldview were suddenly smudged and chaotic. I had walked in there a reluctant defender. I walked out a lawyer with a serious problem. The problem was that my client's story was plausible and, worse, verifiable. Crystal's was not. My professional duty, the one Manuel had thrown in my face, was no longer a burden. It was a compass. And it was pointing in a direction I never thought I'd travel. That evening, I went home and did something I hadn't done yet. I looked into Crystal, not as a sister in arms, but as the opposing party in a legal case. I opened her social media profiles, which were all public. She had cultivated an image of a confident, empowered, and occasionally victimized woman. Her bio had a link to her blog, which was full of articles about toxic masculinity and female resilience. It was all very familiar. It was a mirror of my own online world. I scrolled back through her posts to the night of the alleged incident. My stomach tightened. There it was, a photo, time-stamped at 11:52 p.m. It was a blurry selfie of her and two friends, grinning, holding up colorful drinks in a loud, crowded bar. The caption was 3 words, "Best night ever," with a fire emoji. I stared at the picture for a long time. According to her statement to the police, less than an hour before this photo was taken, she had been the victim of a terrifying assault. She was supposed to be traumatized, shaken, alone in her apartment. Instead, she was out with friends, apparently having the best night ever. The discrepancy was staggering. It wasn't just a hole in her story, it was a canyon. The next day, I took a long lunch. I went to the bar Scott had named. It was a quiet, typical downtown place. I found the bartender who had worked that night. I showed him pictures of Scott and Crystal on my phone. He remembered them. He said it was a slow night, a weeknight. He recalled that they seemed like a very standard, awkward first date. No drama, no loud voices. He specifically remembered Scott leaving alone. He was certain about it. He said Scott paid, said goodnight, and walked out. What was more interesting was what he said about Crystal. He told me she stayed for at least another hour after Scott left. She moved to the bar, ordered another drink, and was chatting and laughing with a group of guys at the other end. He described her as being in a great mood, completely fine. I thanked him and left a generous tip. Walking back to the office, the city felt different. The certainties I had lived with for years were dissolving. The simple equation I had in my head, man accuses, woman denies, woman accuses, man is guilty, was proving to be useless, childishly simple. That weekend I met up with my friends, the same ones who had told me to sabotage the case. I thought, naively, that if I just laid out the facts for them, the receipts, the rideshare data, the bartender, the Instagram post, they would see what I was seeing. They would understand. I was wrong. I explained everything, clinically, like I was presenting evidence. They listened with stony faces. When I finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Then one of them said that I was internalizing the patriarchy. Another told me that trauma manifests in different ways, and maybe Crystal's way of coping was to go out and pretend everything was fine. The third one, the most militant of the group, accused me of betraying them. She said that facts and timelines were tools men used to discredit women's lived experiences. She said my job was to believe the victim, period. I tried to argue. I said my job was to seek the truth. I said that lived experience couldn't be a magic shield against verifiable contradictory evidence. The conversation got heated. They called me a mouthpiece for a predator. They said I was choosing a man over my sisters. By the end of the night, it was clear that something had irrevocably broken. I left, feeling utterly alone. My ideological home had just evicted me. In the weeks leading up to the trial, the pressure became immense. Crystal's story was picked up by several online media outlets. She gave interviews, always tearful, always vague on the details, but powerful in her emotion. She was a hero. Scott was a monster. And I, by extension, was the monster's lawyer. My name was mentioned in articles and on social media. I was called a traitor, a gender traitor, an enemy of women. I had to lock all my social media accounts. The community that had once celebrated my witty takedowns was now calling for my disbarment. I threw myself into the casework. It was the only thing that made sense. Manuel called me into his office once, a few days before the trial. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just asked if my case was solid. I told him it was. He nodded, looking out the window. He said that public opinion is a weather vane, but the law is supposed to be a foundation. "Don't get distracted by the wind," he said, and dismissed me. The day the trial began, the courtroom was packed. On one side sat Crystal, surrounded by a phalanx of supporters and friends, my former friends among them. They glared at me as I walked past. On the other side, there was just me and Scott. He looked smaller than ever in his ill-fitting suit. The prosecution went first. The DA was slick and confident. He painted a vivid picture of a vulnerable woman and a calculating predator. Then he called Crystal to the stand. She was brilliant. She cried at all the right moments. Her voice trembled as she recounted her lived experience. She never gave specifics, but her emotional performance was devastating. She spoke of her fear, her violation, her pain. I looked at the jury. They were captivated. They were looking at Scott with open disgust. By the time she stepped down, I knew the prosecution had built a mountain of emotion. My job was to dismantle it with a handful of facts. Then it was my turn. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. I called Crystal back to the stand for cross-examination. I started gently. I asked her to confirm the date and time of the events. She did. I asked her to confirm, again, the time she claimed the assault happened. She said it was around 11 p.m. I approached the witness stand and presented the first piece of evidence. This is a certified record of Mr. Scott's rideshare account for that evening. It shows him being picked up several blocks from your apartment at 10:47 p.m. And this is the GPS data from the ride, showing him arriving at his own home 6 miles away at 11:12 p.m. Can you please explain to the court how Mr. Scott could have been assaulting you at your doorway at 11 p.m. when this data proves he was in a car miles away? She stammered. She said she might have been mistaken about the exact time. The DA objected, but the judge overruled him. The first crack had appeared in her story. Next, I brought up the Instagram post. I had it blown up on a large poster board for the jury to see. Ms. Crystal, you testified that you were deeply traumatized and spent the night in fear. Is this your social media account? Is this a photo you posted at 11:52 p.m. on the night in question? Is that your caption? Best night ever? ? She turned pale. She said her friends had dragged her out, that she was just trying to feel normal. The excuse sounded weak, even to her own ears. The jury was starting to look at her differently. The sympathy was curdling into suspicion. I then called my only witness, the bartender. He was nervous, but his testimony was simple and unshakable. He confirmed Scott left alone. He confirmed Crystal stayed behind, had another drink, and was laughing and talking with other men. He was a neutral observer with nothing to gain, and his words drained all the air out of Crystal's narrative of a terrified victim. For my final move, I presented the evidence that had been the hardest to get. Through a subpoena, I had obtained the text messages Crystal had sent to her best friend the morning after the date. The prosecution fought it, but the judge allowed it. I read the key message aloud to the court, my voice steady. It was sent at 9:14 a.m. I can't believe that boring IT guy actually turned me down. He literally said he was tired and left. Nobody rejects me. Don't worry, I'm going to make him regret it. He'll see what happens when you disrespect me. A gasp went through the courtroom. It was over. The motive was laid bare for everyone to see. It wasn't about assault. It was about a bruised ego. Crystal stared at me from the stand, her face a mask of pure hatred. In that moment, she wasn't a victim. She was just a liar who had been caught. The jury was out for less than an hour. The verdict came back, not guilty. The half of the courtroom that supported Crystal erupted in anger. My former friends looked at me with a loathing I could physically feel. Scott just sat there, his shoulders slumped, as if the verdict was too heavy to lift. He didn't look happy. He just looked tired. As we packed up our things, he turned to me. He looked me in the eyes for the first time. All he said was, "Thank you." Then he walked out of the courtroom, alone. His name was cleared, but his reputation was destroyed. He'd been all over the news, his face plastered everywhere. He had won, but he had lost so much. I walked out of the courthouse into the evening air. My phone buzzed with notifications of hate mail and angry comments. My friends were gone. My online community was gone. I had done my job. I had defended an innocent man. I had won. But I felt completely and utterly empty. Which brings me to now. I'm sitting in my apartment. It's late. The city is quiet. I've been staring at a blank screen for hours. I built my entire identity, my career, my social life, on a simple, comforting idea that the world was divided into oppressors and victims, and I knew exactly who was who. I thought I was fighting for justice. I thought I was on the right side of history. Today, I use the system I once mocked to save a man from the very ideology I championed. And in doing so, I saw its dark reflection. I saw how the righteous crusade for justice could be twisted into a weapon for personal vengeance. I saw how the shield I wanted to give to the vulnerable could be used as a sword by the malicious. I won my case, but I lost my faith, my friends, my sense of self, everything. I look back at the person I was a few months ago, so sure of everything, so smug in her convictions, and I barely recognize her. I was wrong about everything.